Good morning, everyone. Here we go. Covered daily for the first time NFL playoff edition. We are past the regular season and on to the postseason. I am Adam Chernoff, and I'll be with you here on Covers YouTube every weekday morning from now until the Super Bowl. And when Super Bowl week comes, I mean, it's one game every day. We're going to deep dive into props, but leading you up to the big game, we're going to have bookmakers, we're going to have bettors, and all of the best information for you to keep you up to date with everything going on in the postseason. And right now we are going to get into the wild card games in just a second. But first, we're going to talk about some of the differences when you're betting on the playoffs versus the regular season and how you want to ultimately approach things as a bettor. We saw these numbers hit the board late last night, a little bit of a scramble for books competing over each other to post numbers, and everything's kind of settled now. There's definitely some subtle differences that you want to think about in terms of trying to get to a number or trying to find the bet, because the big challenge here is so much of what is out there between the teams is going to be priced into the market. Like, there's not many secrets like there might be in the regular season in terms of news or things during the week or how different bettors are going to approach them from limit bumps. So if you are looking at betting some of these games, it's important now to start thinking about, first of all, the home field advantage increase. Historically, over the last decade and a half, home teams have won at about a 9% higher rate in the postseason. And this year, I think it's significant because we've seen home field advantage in the regular season almost as low as we ever had it. Last year was a bit of an anomaly, but this year on a game-by-game basis, home field advantage was being priced in right around 1 point per game. And there's bettors out there that are going to be listening to this and sort of being stuck at that 3 point per game level. And it might be a bit of a surprise, but for the regular season, most bettors were putting about a point for home field advantage. And as we get into the playoffs, that's just naturally going to be higher because of the situation, but especially as we progress too. So what is now going to be increased for the wild card round, as we progress in the playoffs, historically, home field has increased in terms of value as you get into the divisional round to the conference championship. So for the most part, myself, I'm treating home field advantage about double for what I have in the regular season. No one's getting more than a field goal in terms of how I have it weighted. But in a lot of these matchups, it's just increased. And we're seeing that right now in the market itself. We have 5 different rematches, and all of the home teams in those rematches are higher than what they were in the regular season matchup. And so it's not necessarily a coincidence that we're seeing that. So it's another example of how things are starting to be priced in. But if you're looking at these playoff games, you have to sort of keep that in mind. Otherwise, you're going to be looking at sort of numbers that you might think are off, but they're not necessarily that different from where they should be just because of that extra weighted home field advantage. Another thing you want to think about is the impact that playoff games have on young quarterbacks. Specifically, we'll start with the impact that rookies have in playoff games. So 11 rookie quarterbacks have started a playoff game since 2010. The record in those games is just 2-9 for those rookies. And there was a bit of an exception last year with John Wolford starting for the Rams, but he was hurt very early in the game. That brought Jared Goff back into the game. He had the injured hand. Didn't seem to bother him, but McVay did start Wolford. So that's on the side here within this equation. But obviously, when a rookie is forced to make his first ever playoff start, has not been good. The last rookie quarterback we saw win a playoff game was Russell Wilson way back in 2012, 9 years ago. The obvious rookie making a start this year, Mac Jones for the New England Patriots, who go on the road to face divisional opponent Buffalo Bills. He is a 4.5 point underdog at Buffalo within that matchup. So when you think about where we saw this game in that first meeting in Buffalo, right around Bills -3, some more things we'll touch on in the matchup in just a second, but already another indication of either that home field / rookie quarterback combination being a little bit accounted for within that number. But beyond just the rookie quarterbacks, there's also an impact on just QBs making their first ever start altogether within the playoffs. In the last 10 years, there's been 27 such occasions, just 9 wins for those first-time starting quarterbacks. If you want to go all the way back to 2002, first-time starters 16 and 36 in their opening playoff game. And we've got a couple of them this year. Joe Burrow, Mac Jones, as we just mentioned, Jalen Hurts, Kyler Murray, and I think surprising to a lot of folks, Derek Carr. The Raiders did make the playoffs with him on the roster, but it was a situation where he ultimately got hurt and did not end up starting that wild card game against the Houston Texans. All of those first-time quarterbacks this year in the playoffs are underdogs, except for Joe Burrow, who's laying 6.5 as the QB of the Bengals. Derek Carr on the other side of that game, again, a bit of an interesting mismatch, but we're seeing like all of these young quarterbacks now on the underdog side of the equation. And maybe the most surprising of sort of these early playoff round adjustments that we're going to make is that big favorites perform very well. And this is going back to sort of that idea that a lot of things ultimately get priced in, especially when there's a very big mismatch between two teams that are playing each other. And TA, who's one of the best football follows that we're going to have on the show, hopefully later this week, came out with a fantastic tweet this morning just looking at double-digit favorites in the NFL. So in wild card round history, we've seen 10 favorites that were double digits. The average winning margin for those double-digit favorites, 17 points. And this season, we get the Kansas City Chiefs, currently 12.5-point favorites. That's the biggest number any wild card team has ever laid to an opponent in the wild card round. So that's a significant point spread that people might be looking at and say, well, this is just, it's too many points. I'm going to take the Steelers. That logic hasn't really worked out when it comes to wild card rounds. And it's not a situation where you're just going to see big favorites just mispriced. A lot of that's going to be accounted for when it comes to these playoff markets. So when you're just looking at these first 6 games of the postseason, remember, home field advantage, a little bit more than what you see during the regular season. QBs, especially rookies and first-time starters, those tend to perform a lot worse than your veteran QBs on the other side. And if you're looking at some of these bigger numbers and saying, that's just too many points, hasn't necessarily been the case, especially when favorites get into the double-digit range. A lot of that just ends up ultimately being priced in. So a couple things to think about ahead of Wild Card Weekend. We'll get to each of the matchups in just a second. Before we do, I think it's important to set the table a little bit here, as 5 of the 6 games that we're going to see on Wild Card Weekend were a rematch of a regular season game that took place. So we've seen 5 of these 6 matchups. 2 of them, Buffalo, New England, and LA, Arizona, are both divisional games. So we've seen those matchups twice. And what's interesting here is when you look at how those games played out, there's interesting adjustments for each of them. So Cincinnati, Las Vegas, they played back in November. The Bengals closed a 2-point favorite in Las Vegas. That game right now is Cincinnati minus 6.5. So a 4-point adjustment. Bengals won 32-13. That game was tied in the fourth quarter. So it's a 4.5-point adjustment. But when you think about the value of home field, if you're just doing the venue swap and sort of doing that math, you're giving the Bengals about 2 points for home field advantage. You're getting pretty close to about 5.5 or 6. So if there's a little bit of an adjustment up in terms of the Bengals for their performance over the last 4 to 5 weeks down the stretch, as well as the advantages in that first match, we're pretty close to where we probably should be on just a pure adjustment. An interesting matchup that we're seeing, a pretty considerable adjustment, I would say, the Bills minus 4.5. In that first meeting on Monday Night Football played in Buffalo, they closed an expensive 2.5 or a flat 3 at even money. In New England, that game closed Patriots minus 1. So we're looking at the Bills minus 4.5 now, a pretty considerable adjustment. They obviously lost in Buffalo that first meeting on Monday Night Football, And then in New England, they won comfortably 33-20. Josh Allen look this entire season. And quite frankly, the worst we've seen Mac Jones on the other side look. So quite an adjustment here. And the Bills, they're going to get a bump for home field, obviously, relative to what they see in the regular season. But 4.5 up from 3 when we saw this game played last time. Tampa Bay, 8.5-point favorites. They played Philly back in October. That was a game on a short week, Thursday Night Football. Closed Tampa -7 in Philadelphia. That's now Tampa 8.5 back in Florida. And a game that's probably going to tick up just a little bit. Don't think it gets to 10, but it's probably going to close on that meaningless 9 or 9.5-point range. But again, another favorite off of a win. They won 28-22. Brady kneeled the game out inside the 5-yard line. That's now being adjusted up. Maybe the venue switch not necessarily being priced in to a full extent. Chiefs -12.5 against Pittsburgh. We saw this game played in KC on Boxing Day. The Chiefs led 30-0 midway through the second half. It was incredibly one-sided. That's now 12.5. It was opened at 13.5. And so there's been Steelers money initially, something I don't really agree with entirely within that matchup. And then the Rams -4, closed -3 in LA earlier in the season. That was back early October against Arizona. But these two teams played in December. It was really that game that turned the Rams season around. They closed as a 3-point dog in Arizona. Cardinals have been much better on the road. So that's a bit of an interesting mismatch in terms of how this price has now swung all the way through 0 to the other side. But there is that previous meeting where it closed Rams -3. So either way, within any of these rematches, we're seeing a pretty significant adjustment up. A lot of that is home field being accounted for and that extra bump within the playoffs, but also some scenarios too. So lots to talk about as we just look at the market as a whole and that perspective as we go through week by week. It feels so different just from a betting perspective on my side when you're looking at this. And it's like there's an initial reaction that you tend to have with games, but then you remember it's like postseason, playoffs, home field, quarterback situations, and it changes a lot of the thinking. And I'm really curious to get bookmakers' thoughts on this and how they approach it internally. We're going to have a couple really good ones in the next couple of days. So looking at the individual matchups, the first game that I bet last night, and I tweeted it out, were the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I played it at -8. There was -7 available, and we saw a difference within this matchup between what opened at the regulated books in the U.S. and a difference at what opened offshore. And in this case, it was offshore leading the regulated markets, which were at 7. Offshore opened 8, and we've seen this now move up. Like I mentioned a minute or two ago, I don't think this is a game that gets to 10, although I think it deserves to be at 10. But there's just going to be sort of a natural stop within this matchup. For me, when I look at all of the games this week, the 6 of them, and try to do sort of X's and O's and look at the matchup of personnel on the field, obviously the Steelers are a terrible matchup for them against the Chiefs. But I would say that the Eagles matched up against the Buccaneers is arguably worse. So the Philadelphia defense with Jonathan Gannon, who I love as a defensive coordinator, but unfortunately with the personnel that the Eagles have, it's just incredibly soft. They've allowed the highest completion percentage to opposing quarterbacks of the regular season. Nearly 70% of quarterback passes against the Eagles have been completed. Tom Brady has been the second most accurate quarterback this season in terms of completion percentage, but the Buccaneers also have the highest passing rate as well as the most passing touchdowns and are the most pass-reliant team in the NFL. So when you look at the strength of the Buccaneers offense against the weakness of this Eagles defense, just like we saw in that first Thursday night matchup, it's a spot where the Buccaneers can just walk up and down the field getting exactly what they want. And it's not something that the Eagles can necessarily go out of their way from a personnel perspective and just change. It's just a terrible matchup for this Eagles defense against this Buccaneers offense. And if you start to think about it from like a playoff scenario and some of the injuries that the Buccaneers have, like who is Brady going to trust most on this team? It's Rob Gronkowski. We saw that last year in the playoffs too. the Eagles have allowed the most receptions and the most touchdowns to tight ends of any defense during the regular season. So not only is it a team that's incredibly soft, that allows opponents to pass at will and complete a lot of passes, getting exactly what they want, the one area where they struggle most within that is the area that the Buccaneers and Brady trust the most, with Gronkowski over the middle. So it's just, even with some of the personnel injuries that the Buccaneers have suffered over the last 3 to 4 weeks of the regular season, this is just a horrible matchup for the Eagles defense matched up against this Buccaneers offense. And then if you flip things around, it doesn't get any better on the other side. The strength of the Buccaneers defense is stopping the run. Now, admittedly, it's important to point out that over the last 6 weeks of the regular season, the Buccaneers' run defense has taken a step back. It went from top 2 or 3 in the first 12 weeks of the season to the last 6, coming back a little bit closer to average. But this is still a Buccaneers defense that's extremely good in the front 7 defending the run. What do the Eagles like to do more than anything on offense? Run the football. And so it's a difficult for me to see within this handicap where the Eagles offense is going to have a ton of success, because they're running into the strength of the Buccaneers defense. And if we just take like a higher level view and take a step back and sort of look at this from kind of just a simple basic perspective, you get Nick Sirianni versus Bruce Arians, first-time playoff head coach against a head coach who has been there and done that. You get Jalen Hurts, a first-time QB making his first playoff start, against Tom Brady, who's obviously been there and done that. And you add that into sort of the weaknesses that the Eagles have against the Buccaneers' strengths, and I think this is just a really bad matchup for Philadelphia. So Buccaneers were a bet that I was pretty happy to make at 8. Thought this game deserved to be 10. Roger Kane, I love the defensive special teams touchdown prop for Tampa Bay against Philadelphia. I could see it. I'm not necessarily running to bet that, but certainly with how things match up, you would expect the Eagles to be playing from behind and needing to pass a little bit more. If the Buccaneers are able to take Smith, or at least limit him from the equation, kind of puts the Eagles at a little bit of a stretch for other passing options. Hurts playing catch-up is not ideal in any scenario. So a bit indifferent myself on that prop specifically. Obviously, we don't have prices. We'll see what that number ultimately opens up at. But I think the Buccaneers, very good bet. If you're looking for another teaser leg to go with that, admittedly, it's kind of difficult. Ideally, there would be another team that you could pair with the Buccaneers. That would make a very, very good teaser. But this week, we're just not seeing a lot of different options to sort of pair with that in a teaser. Perhaps we'll see some of these numbers move and there's a little bit more of an option to take. But the Buccaneers, I think, a really good side, and probably one that's going to be quite popular this week. Another bet that I made, and this was the difficulty of me having a Twitter account that people follow and trying to send out bets. So I, again, have all the sports books up last night, and I'm looking at all the different prices. And the 49ers have been a professional side for the last about 6 to 7 weeks. For the early part of the regular season, it bounced around between, like, the Eagles were in focus, that sort of faded. And then really we saw the Colts take a lot of money. And at the end of the season, the 49ers were without question the professional side week after week after week. They were taking money within the market. We saw them in the Rams game get bet significantly, even with the quarterback uncertainty. There was a lot of support for San Francisco that week. And so it was interesting to see the divide between the numbers we got offshore and the numbers that were at regulated books immediately after open yesterday when these playoff prices first came out. So the books that tend to cater to at least a couple groups that I knew had been backing San Francisco opened the Niners as 3-point underdogs against the Dallas Cowboys. Then there were offshore books that opened up that do not necessarily cater to those same players and were more sort of facing recreational sides of players. and they went Cowboys -4.5. And so there was this about 10 to 12 minute window last night where offshore had San Francisco 4.5 or 4. And then all the regulated books that had the price up had the Niners at 3. And we didn't have like a true market making book that caters to a lot of professionals with the price up. So it was really a difference of opinions on what was ultimately available from that number. But you could sort of see the books that had catered to those professional players were very skewed to their view on the 49ers, whereas those books that didn't were sort of anticipating the Cowboys being the more back team. It was a really interesting divide. So I scooped up San Francisco. I took 4.5 personally, and I took 4. We're now looking at 3. So for me, that's a bit of a different story at this point. I would still lean towards the 49ers at this number, but it's not nearly as enticing of a bet right now. But it's a game that we're probably going to see the Cowboys take a little bit of attention, obviously being such a popular team. But where I look at this and sort of get a little bit intrigued beyond just knowing who has been backing the Niners, the strength behind some of these moves, and it's just hard to ignore when you're watching the market and you're seeing what's being bet on them. When you look at this from just like a matchup perspective, right? The Cowboys offense, or the Cowboys defensively matched up against the Niners offense. That pass rush for the Cowboys and how that's come on the last 4 to 6 weeks, to me, has been the big story of this defense. I'm not ready to speak incredibly well about the secondary, which has been extremely opportunistic. But if you look on a down-by-down basis, this secondary has given up a ton of yardage and a ton of space to opposing offenses. They've got a ton of turnovers, and it's benefited them well. But if that's not there, this is a defense that is very gettable for opposing offenses. But where the Cowboys have struggled the entire season is defending the run. They're 23rd in that regard over the course of the season. And the schedule of run offenses that they have faced hasn't been overly strong either. So it's a really soft run defense, which for the Niners in a game like this is exactly what they want to do offensively. And whether it's with backs out of the backfield, whether it's with Deebo Samuel, the Niners want to be the run-first team, and they can certainly be that against this Cowboys defense. And so while we're going to listen to media all week, and it's going to be hyping up the Cowboys secondary and how great they've been in coverage and on and on and on, it's not the case. It's not the case at all. They've been opportunistic. Let's not confuse those two things for opportunistic being great in coverage. And I think it's a spot where the 49ers saw schematically, or sort of like a personnel makeup wise, sort of a similar defense in the Rams last week, or yesterday rather. And they were able to get a lot of what they wanted, both on the ground and running. But if we think about the Rams, it's an aggressive pass rush. It's 1 or 2 corners in the secondary that are very aggressive in coverage, that, again, they want to be very opportunistic. And it's a Rams defense that, much like the Cowboys, is soft against the run. And they're built well. I'm not trying to say that this is not what you want in a football team, but just from a 1-week matchup perspective against the Niners, it's just not a great matchup for them overall. And the Cowboys offensively, to me, come into the postseason extremely inflated. So some of this is intentionally done. If you're listening to Jerry Jones the last couple of weeks of the season, especially last week, there was this extra effort exerted by the Cowboys to inflate the score in a lot of these games, to carry the momentum, as he called it on his weekly radio show, into the postseason. So, like, when we're looking at the Cowboys' final score, 2 of the final 3 weeks, they put up north of 50 points. But last week was against the Eagles' backups. Philadelphia didn't play anybody in the secondary. It was all backups. So, like, of course, you're expecting the Cowboys in a game where they play the starters into the fourth quarter, despite it being a meaningless football team, or a meaningless football game, they're going to be the team that looks dominant. And they did. And it's a spot where you could put 25 other offenses in that situation, and they're going to have a massive offensive output, just like Dallas did. And then that other game against Washington, that was a Washington football team that had 25 guys on the COVID list leading up to it. And it was practices were upheaved. The whole game was a complete mess for Washington, and they just get put in that situation. And then, of course, the Cowboys run up the score in that game as well. And you start going back down the schedule, and you look at some of like these big offensive outbursts for the Cowboys, or at least wins down the stretch. They beat the Giants 21-6. They beat the Saints in another COVID game. They didn't have Alvin Kamara. They were without a number of other starters. They beat them 27-17. They have another game against Washington, which was also impacted by COVID. They win 27-20. Their big win against the Falcons, 43-3, another team that's not in the postseason that the Cowboys were able to beat up on. And then you start to look at the teams that they are going to be facing, which were in the playoffs. They lose to the Cardinals, 25-22. They lose to the Raiders, 36-33 at home on Thanksgiving. They lose to the Chiefs, 19-9. And so the difference in schedule the last 9 to 10 weeks for the Cowboys has been pretty dramatic. These wins and these big offensive outbursts have come against really weak opponents who in many cases were impacted by injuries or COVID. And then when they have to step up and play an opponent that we are looking at as being in the playoffs, they've lost every game. And so the splits between the two are pretty dramatic. And now you get a 49ers team, which, again, they've got pro support week after week after week and being built up as this side to watch in the playoffs. Well, it's an above average defense. It's an above average offense. And what they want to do offensively works very well against the weakness of the Cowboys defense. And so I was looking at that price and the differences between what we were seeing offshore, what we were seeing at regulated books where we could bet. And the points were too many to take, or too many to pass up. And so I was pretty happy to take the 49ers in that spot, getting more than a field goal. And now at 3, it's certainly 49ers are nothing for me. But we'll see how this number ultimately trends through the rest of the week. The Cowboys, obviously a very popular team. They're going to get attention. It's just a matter of where this number ultimately goes. But certainly if it comes off of the field goal, the 49ers are absolutely in play the rest of the week. And we had a good comment here from Brendan W. Dallas does not perform well against teams with winning records. It's exactly it. A lot of their schedule and wins this year have been padded by playing teams within the division or playing non-playoff teams. And it's not all dissimilar from some of the teams that we've seen in the AFC. I mean, Buffalo immediately comes to mind as a team that sort of benefited from a very weak schedule, and a lot of their wins aren't overly impressive, but the Bills' performance within those games was impressive. There was a team that finished top 3 in net yards per play, in net success rate. Their wins were below expectation, but they were covering a lot of those big numbers. And they were a team that was getting bet on game day when the limits are highest, laying 13, 15, 16 points, and getting big wins and getting big covers for people backing them in those spots. So it's a little different with Dallas, where that hasn't necessarily been the case. It's a little bit of a different spot overall. So I think the Cowboys just a little bit inflated coming into this postseason. 4 more games on the slate that we will get to in episodes as we progress throughout the week. I have not bet any of the other ones. Before I let everyone go and get on with the day here on a Monday afternoon, interesting to see that the Steelers continue to get bet. Again, like in the wild card round, these big favorites have performed very well. And I don't know what anybody could have seen in that first meeting on Boxing Day that would give you any confidence to going back to Steelers. And if you're looking at the Chiefs and potentially struggling defensively down the stretch, and you're pointing to the last 2 games, well, how about pointing to the Steelers struggling offensively the last 2 games? Yeah, they get wins back-to-back weeks to get into the playoffs. 3.9 yards per play in those wins. So, again, like just the matchup-wise, when we're looking at this, it is incredibly one-sided in the Chiefs' favor within this matchup and in this game. I'll be very happy to break down in more detail tomorrow, but I'm curious to see how low this gets. I mean, we were at 13.5. We're at 12.5 now, and a lot of those 12.5s are shaded lower. And so I have no idea who's comfortable betting Pittsburgh here, but the Steelers have been bet the last 12 hours since these numbers open. So keep betting them. I've got my eye on the number. I'd love to have a Chiefs ticket, but I'm just going to wait this one out and see ultimately what the floor is. At the 30-minute mark tomorrow, we will have the first guest on the show. I'll keep it a surprise. You've got to tune in tomorrow to see who it is. One of the most respected bookmakers in the United States, works for a major regulated sports book, and we're going to get a lot of good information because he does certainly not shy away from taking a position, nor does he shy away from his trading team potentially taking a number in the market that's a little bit different. And they were one of the early books to post yesterday, so we're going to get a lot of good information for where he set these numbers and where he thinks they're going to go. That'll be tomorrow. We got more bookmakers to come later in the week, as well as bettors, and we'll absolutely touch on all of these games and get into props as they come out Wednesday and Thursday morning and have it all broken down for you here on the Covers YouTube channel. For Covers Daily NFL Playoff Edition, I am Adam Chernoff. We'll talk to you tomorrow at 12 p.m.